Today's goal is to finish installing the motor, so basically we're just going to take the wiring harness and reroute it where it should be, plug everything back in. So right now it's all kind of just laid up on the subframe right now, so make sure all the connections are there. Then we're going to get the exhaust stud in, pull those gaskets that are in there so we can put fresh ones in, and then we'll reinstall the exhaust, reinstall the radiator, make sure the fans are on there, and then we'll pretty much be good to go and start working on the subframe stuff once this is all together. To install the exhaust stud, you can kind of thread it by hand for the most part, but the best thing to do is take 2 of the old exhaust nuts. I cut them down and you'll double nut them. So you'll thread kind of like this. You'll put the flanges together basically like that on that part of the stud and then jam them up together, and then you can take a regular socket and you'll be able to tighten the stud into the block the rest of the way. And then once these start threading down the stud, then you know you've bottomed out, and then you can just pull those off. That way you can get the stud nice and tight. For gasket sealer, you'll need some 3-bond 127B sealant. We're gonna finish putting the exhaust on the bike right now. What I like to do is take some of this anti-seize and I put it on the ends of the studs, and I also use a little dab of it to keep the gaskets in place on the motor. And the one thing you'll notice about these Honda gaskets is one side is round, completely smooth and round, and then the other side, it has this like seam or ridge. They don't really give you an orientation for it, but what I like to do is put this smooth side towards the motor and have this seam on the pipe. If you actually take this gasket and line it up, this seam kind of fits the exact diameter of the pipe, and from a flow perspective it kind of makes sense to have the seam on the outside. The old ones, basically 3 out of the 4 were like that, where the crushed side on the pipe had the seam out and the smooth side was towards the motor. So I'm just gonna stick with that orientation. I think that's what I did last time. First thing I did was the starter motor wire, and it goes underneath the subframe here, and then under the shock reservoir line here, on top of the radiator hose, and then right onto the starter motor. Travels like that, under, and over and on top. So for this part of the harness, I have this big gray connector. I have it running underneath here on the outside. It's underneath the stator connector wire, so it goes on the outside of the main wiring harness underneath, and then it's connected underneath the shock reservoir line. O2 sensor comes off the harness here on the back side of this clip, and then down freely on this side of the motor here. We have the black plug here. I don't know if you can see that. The stator wires run along the subframe here. I put it on the outside of the main wiring harness. Underneath the shock reservoir line there. Stator connectors, the white plug. Black plug right here. That kind of all tucks away in there. Main wiring harness is all on top. Gray connector. Right there. O2 sensor. Black connector. And then obviously right here is the stator. These set of plugs are just gonna sit right down there. You got the big gray clear, and then the kickstand is the green right there. The last part of the harness here were these three connections: the clear from the front of the motor, the green for the kickstand, and then there's a gray from here. Pretty much the gray stayed exactly where it was. The clear from the front, you see snakes up and over the center motor mount. It stays on the inside of the frame. Then for the kickstand sensor, it starts down here, and I have it go underneath the shift shaft like that, and then it routes through here, so it's not behind the water pump bolt. Kind of just trails up here, and I do have it going underneath this radiator hose here, and then it's connected right there. That seems to be the best routing for that. And then the rest of the main wiring harness is kind of where things are going to stay. Stays along the frame here, kind of tucked down. I have it staying on the inside here. This one goes behind the clean air mod hoses, and this is where I'll do the ignition panel, the clutch switch bypass. So that's kind of where I want it, because that's where the panel will sit. Here's your clutch switch bypass right here. Basically all you have to do is take the two wires off the harness, and you can jump them together, use a fuse. I just took the plug off of the hand controls, and then you just pull out the pins. So all you're left with is just the two wires that go to the clutch switch pins off the harness. So when you plug this in, you're just jumping those two wires. So this is what you have off the hand controls. There's just two spade connectors, and prior I just put the fuse in here and had this huge long thing. So I just crimped some of my own spade connectors on there. You'll just plug the clutch switch bypass right into this gray plug off the harness here. Obviously you could just jump the two wires together right there. You don't need a fuse. Or you can even do the same thing I did for the tip sensor bypass and just put a jumper onto the two wires, hot glue it in place, tape it up. Also another option, I like having the plug there. I think it's a little bit cleaner. If I had another plug, I probably could have done the same thing for the tip sensor bypass too. The injector plugs go here, and then this is the plug for the coil packs. So for the coil packs, the plug's right here, and then I have it going behind the clean air mod, just like that. So I got three on the inside, two on the inside, and then one's coming on the outside there. This plug right here is your pair sensor valve, and then this guy I'm just gonna tape off. Actually, this is my radiator. I can't tape that off. My bad. I was wondering what this was for. That's for that'll plug into the radiator here. So that needs to be right about there. Once I get the cage on and the speedo mounted to it, I have my speedo plugs here, so I can rearrange those where I want. I just keeping it tucked out of the way for now. But that's pretty much it for the wiring. we finished modifying the subframe. I gotta clean up all the metal shavings, but cut the subframe down a little bit, kept it a little longer than the first build. First build went to the back of this part of the subframe, but because we're leaving the relays and the ECU mount to make the 1 o'clock plate fit and still be able to bolt it in, I had to leave it a little bit longer. It's really only about an inch or so longer than I had before, and that really isn't going to be a big deal because the reason why I had it cut so deep in the first place was because of clutch bumps. If you want to get deep enough, you really don't want anything smacking the back end when you're dropping the bike back like that. And I was reviewing the footage, and there's really never a time where on the deepest of clutch bumps that I ever came close to hitting the 1 o'clock plate. So this extra inch really isn't going to make a big difference. We got the subframe cut here, and then the battery tray is cut nice and straight right here. That's kind of what we're looking like. I didn't cut off any of the excess here because we left the ECU mount, which is a little different than last time. And then my fairing mounts here and here. So the fairings are going to mount in 2 places up top here and then to the bottom of the battery tray. For the battery tray mounting on the subframe on the last bike, I had drilled through the subframe and mounted the 1 o'clock plate through the battery tray as well. But because we're mounting the battery tray on this part of the subframe, last time it was down on this bottom portion, and then I could just drill holes through the battery tray and that would be supported when the 1 o'clock plate gets mounted. But this time, to mount the battery tray, I'm using these Velcro zip ties. I got 4 of them. I thought this would be a little bit better than regular zip ties because those probably are a little more brittle, and I feel like with impact they would crack. We'll see how these hold up. I don't have a feeling they'll break, but they might stretch out and loosen over time. But right now, this battery tray is pretty locked in, so I'm pretty happy with that. And then the fairing here, this is kind of how I have it cut as of now. This was just a rough cut to get an idea. I had this extra tail fairing laying around so I could play around with it. I kind of like the center point's good, but I think I want to match the angle a little more with the 1 o'clock plate and make it a little bit more flush and look cleaner. The only thing I do need to figure out now is how I want to secure the seat again. The extra safety that I had last time was a set of bolts through the subframe, the seat bracket on each side, but with the fairing, I can't really access those, so that's gonna be a little more difficult. I was thinking some cotter pins, but I don't, even though I have space to get my hand through here with the Mike Jensen mod in the middle there, I don't really have the extra long fingers to be able to pull pin out from the inside like that. So we're gonna have to do some brainstorming and figure out an idea for that. The only reason for that is just so if this latch ever comes loose, your seat doesn't fly out on accident. For the nuts and bolts on the 1 o'clock plate, these 2 nuts are M10 1.5, and then I have split lock washers in there as well. For some reason, these are smaller nuts that use a 9/16 wrench, but it somehow still threads on to the M10 bolt. Those bigger nuts on the front use a 17mm wrench, but same setup, split lock washer, nut, bolt straight through. This is kind of the rough look of what the seat and the tail fairing are going to look like. This is the cut in the back. This is kind of what I was talking about, is it lines up well with the 1 o'clock plate like that, but I think I'm going to cut it more of an angle here like that to match the angle of that 1 o'clock plate. Couple tips for the saggy ass fix when you're pulling the shock plates. Obviously you want to jack the bike up so the pressure is off the shock. You saw how easy those bolts slipped out. That's exactly how you want it. This one on the dog bone, you almost have to slide that inner bushing to the left a little bit to get the bolt fully out because it doesn't clear the swing arm. Putting the saggy ass fix plates on, you'll have to jack the bike up more to match the new geometry. You want the bolts to slide in just as easy so you can get the correct torque on them. I like to torque the back 2 bolts to the correct torque spec, and then that front one on the dog bone, you don't really have room to get a torque wrench in there, so I just try and match it with the 2 wrenches by hand. Much easier to do it with the wheel off. You have a lot more room to work with. Even better is taking the subframe off if you have that opportunity, or if it makes sense, because you can just go straight from the top down. But if not, taking the wheel off is your best bet. You could still get to it with the wheel on, but you have a little bit less wiggle room to get your wrenches and sockets in there, so easy to take the wheel off, do it that way. Pop the plates on, torque it up, move on. Put the rad reservoir back in. You don't have to take the subframe fully off. Just pull this bolt and that bolt and then loosen the bottom two, so then the subframe will rotate down, and then you can wiggle this in. It kind of sits on one of the motor mount spacers down underneath there. And then in terms of hose routing, the overflow goes underneath the shock, and then it comes out by the front sprocket cover, and then the hose going to the radiator. If you can see, I have it going under this big hose and then under the cam chain tensioner, and then it stays inside the frame. And then this one that also goes to the radiator is on top of the cam chain tensioner inside of the frame. I might have to cut the ends depending on how they angle out to the radiator. They might be a little too long, but we'll see when the radiator goes back on.
Hottest stash in the carpet. Yeah, we trapping out apartments. I ain't done when you start shit. To be honest, did the flame in my heart, gotta spark it. I didn't know that loving you